Thank you. Good morning, everybody. A pleasure to be back. My, how you have grown. Congratulations to all of you. Einstein famously once said, the formulation of the problem is often more important than the solution. Technology is a means to an end. What's the end? Likewise, leadership is contextual, depending upon the era and the needs. What do we need leadership for today? So I'd like to suggest to you there are three fundamental challenges to which I believe technology and leadership must address. Number one, knowledge today has become a commodity, growing exponentially, changing constantly on every internet-connected device. How many of you had to memorize the periodic table in high school? Raise your hands. Come on, we all did. You may have had a bad year or something, right? So you can tell me how many elements there are, can't you? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Whatever number you come up with is wrong because 2 more were added last month. And could we have a short moment of silence for Pluto, really? I mean, it's tragical what happened. Knowledge, commoditized. It used to be, in an era of knowledge scarcity, that you had to come through us as teachers to acquire knowledge, right? We're the only ones who had the papyrus reeds, the clay tablets, and then those expensive things Gutenberg invented called books. That's no longer true. You no longer need a teacher or even a school to acquire knowledge. Georgia Tech is offering a master's in computer science today for $6,000 that you can take in your bedroom slippers. You never have to leave your computer screen to earn that master's degree. That's going to become widespread in the next 5 to 10 years. What then, in the 21st century, is a teacher for? What's a school for? Challenge one. Challenge two, because knowledge has been commoditized, work is being disrupted and careers transformed at an exponential rate. Law school applications down 30% in 3 years. Why? Because the likelihood that you're going to actually be able to earn a living as a lawyer these days. Similarly, careers in medicine, careers in accounting, you name it. Our kids, in all likelihood, very few of them will have conventional kinds of careers. What they may have, if they and we are incredibly fortunate, is a set of opportunities. A set of opportunities that they discover or perhaps even create themselves. And the question is, will they have the knowledge they need, the skills they need to develop those opportunities? Because you see, today, the world simply no longer cares how much you know. There's no competitive advantage in knowing more than the person next to you because they're going to Google it. They're going to figure it out just in time. Just-in-time learning has to replace just-in-case learning. What the world cares about today is what you can do with what you know, which is a completely different and brand new education problem. Because now, of course, you continue to need content knowledge, but more important than content knowledge is the skill and the will, meaning the motivation, to transform that knowledge, to create new knowledge, to ask new questions, to solve new problems. And speaking of will, that brings us to the third challenge. Student motivation. According to a recent Gallup survey, while 8 in 10 fifth graders report being engaged in their schoolwork, that number drops to 4 in 10 in high schools. And it doesn't matter which high school. Why? I think it's because many of the millennials today really look at the internet as their preferred learning provider. Google never laughs at your questions and say that's a dumb question. Google never says, I'm sorry, we don't have time for that question. On the internet, students can be the architects of their own learning, ask their own questions, see where the links lead. They can connect, they can collaborate, they can create. All things that are far too rare in most of our classrooms. So I want to talk about these three challenges, but I'm particularly going to talk about skill and will. What skill? Will meaning what? Motivation. A number of years ago, I read The World is Flat because my wife, PJ, who's here in the audience, told me to. She was right, as usual. How many of you read The World is Flat, Friedman's book? Many of you. I'm glad to see that. Talked to Tom recently. He said he got one thing wrong in that book. I said, what was that? He said, the pace of change. Happening so much more quickly than he ever imagined possible. I mean, when I read that book, I got scared, frankly. I wanted to know what skills will our young people need to get and keep a good job in the flat world? And are they the same skills they'll need for learning and citizenship? So as some of you know, I undertook what was for me then a very different kind of research. I talked to a wide variety of executives, from Apple to Unilever to the U.S. military, college teachers, community leaders, focus groups with recent college graduates, asking everybody, what are the skills that matter most? What are the gaps? And I came to understand that there's a set of core competencies every young person must be well on the way to mastering before the end of high school, not just for a good job, but equally important for learning and for citizenship. Skills you need for work and skills you need for citizenship, I believe, have converged for the first time in human history. I call them the 7 survival skills. Number 1, critical thinking and problem solving. Over and over again, I've come to see that the leaders in any sector, big business, small business, nonprofit, engage everyone in the workplace in a process of continuous improvement of a product or a solution or a service. They see every employee as intellectual capital that needs to be developed. But when I asked these executives, well, what does critical thinking mean? It got uncomfortable. Because, you know, for us, frankly, it's a buzzword. It's not on the test. We haven't defined it. If you'd asked me a decade ago what would be my definition of critical thinking, well, I will have gotten very professorial and said, well, yes, critical thinking means thinking critically. It's kind of a circular thing, really. I didn't have a definition. I hadn't really thought about it. But those executives have. Over and over again, I got the same response. It really surprised me how consistent it was. They said, critical thinking is all about asking the right questions, asking really good questions, not about the right answer. Because if the answer is right, it's only right for a nanosecond, I was told. It's the right questions. Collaboration across networks and leading by influence is the second skill. As we know, increasingly all work is being done collaboratively, except in education. More and more it's being done virtually. Half of the keynotes I give these days are Skypes. So what skills do you need in that world? When folks at IBM talked with me, they explained that when they have a new problem to solve, a new client, they quite intentionally create a team that represents all of their centers around the world to work on it together virtually. Because they want to create a solution that will work in more than one country or culture. First skill in that kind of team environment, deep appreciation of differences. Cultural, religious, ethnic. But the way those teams are led is profoundly different. They're no longer led by supervisors with positional authority. The middle level of management is gone. They're led by peers through influence. Now we've got a double little problem. Education is arguably the most isolated profession in modern work life, most of us working in silos all day, every day. How are we who have rarely experienced sustained teamwork in the workplace going to teach that skill to our kids? How are we going to ensure that all of our kids, not just the chosen few, learn to lead peers through influence? Third survival skill, agility and adaptability. And it's simply the pace of change, the complexity of problems favors those who are agile and adaptable. Fourth survival skill, initiative and entrepreneurialism. Now, it was Mark Chandler, then General Counsel and Vice President of Cisco Systems, who talked with me about how executives of big businesses like his worry constantly about keeping that entrepreneurial spirit and sense of initiative alive. He said something quite striking to me. He said, you know, if I have an employee who sets and meets 5 goals, a good little doobie, jumps through all the hoops, no longer good enough. But if, on the other hand, I have an employee who sets 10 stretch goals and perhaps only succeeds at 7 or 8, he or she is a hero. But what would that person be as a student in our schools, having missed 2 or 3 out of 10? C, B student? I'll come back to this issue of failure in a few minutes. Fifth survival skill, effective oral and written communication. And it is the #1 complaint of both college teachers and employers. But Mike Summers at Dell put a different spin on it for me. He said, you know, the reason these kids can't write, and he's talking about college graduates, it's because they don't know how to think. They don't know how to reason. And then he said something striking. He said, that's only half the problem. The other half of the problem is, and I quote him, they do not know how to write with voice, meaning to put their own passion and perspective into their communications so as to be truly persuasive. Sixth survival skill, accessing and analyzing information. How many of our graduates leave our schools knowing how to do an effective internet search and critically evaluate the results, especially since the internet is so heavily filtered in most schools? Last survival skill, curiosity and imagination. Now, do you know of Dan Pink's book, A Whole New Mind? Raise your hands. He wrote about curiosity and imagination about 5 years ago in the context of an increasingly sophisticated consumer economy, where we want more beautiful products, more empathetic services. That's why he said the right brain skills are going to be at least as important as left brain skills. But I've come to see the need for curiosity and imagination in a completely new light in the last few years, which I'll explain. So some of you know I wrote this book called The Global Achievement Gap. Came out just about 5 years ago. And quite simply, I defined the global achievement gap as the gap between these new skills and what's tested and taught even in our very best public and independent schools, where I see only one curriculum, especially at the secondary level, test prep. Now let me be clear. I believe in accountability. Of course I believe in assessment. But I think we rely far, far too much on computer-scored multiple-choice tests that have far too much factual recall, the results of which tell us absolutely nothing about college, career, or citizenship readiness in the 21st century. Whether it's AYP, and you know what that means, or AP, meaning advanced placement. We're not getting results from those tests that tell us very much useful at all. One reason why an increasing number of colleges and universities are dropping the entire AP program, Dartmouth College being the most recent. Sadly, what gets tested is all that gets taught in this very high-stakes, increasingly frenetic world. So 2 things happened when this book came out, a good thing and a horrible thing, from my point of view. The good thing was I began getting invitations to speak all over the world. Taiwan, Singapore, Thailand, Australia, last week Dubai, Bahrain, Panama, Spain, England, Finland, West Point, Wall Street. Next week, the Naval War College. I'm not exaggerating. And everywhere I went, leaderships did this. Yep, exactly the skills we need. Jeff Bezos at the Business Council stood up 2 months ago and said, you nailed it. These are exactly the skills we need. So I began to feel perhaps I'd made some kind of a contribution, until increasingly it became clear to me about the bad thing. I'm talking about the global economic collapse. Because you see, for the first time in our history, we saw college graduates come home with a brand new BA degree, the ink barely dry, and an average, depending on who you listen to, of over $30,000 of debt on average, and no jobs. Or jobs that don't require a BA, and certainly don't pay BA wages. We talk about government debt. You know, the debt we should worry about is college graduate debt, because it can't be gotten rid of through bankruptcy. That's the real debt. Depending on whose numbers you believe, somewhere between 27 and 52% of our recent college graduates are either unemployed or underemployed. You read the statistics about the unemployment rate going down, that hides the fact that large numbers of people have stopped looking for jobs in this country. The percentage of all Americans who have a job today or are looking for a job is 63%, the lowest number we have had since women began entering the labor force in the late 70s. Nobody's talking about that. So I began to worry about a lot of things, like, you know, I thought college was supposed to teach kids skills. Turns out I was wrong. How many of you know the study Academically Adrift? Raise your hands. Most important study in the last couple of years about education, I think. The authors of the study discovered that after 2 years of college, 45% of all kids are no more able to think critically or write effectively than when they started college. Took lots of courses, maybe went to some cool parties, didn't necessarily become more skillful in what matters most in the 21st century. Because you see, we haven't defined college as being about skills. We define so much of school, including college, as being about mastering content. Content you can get online. But as I talk to these executives, I begin to realize that isn't the whole story. Because now that they have the pick of the employee market, they were looking for more than just these skills. Those were necessary, but no longer sufficient. They were looking for this, as Tom Friedman says, spark of imagination, something more. They are looking for, in a word, innovators. And by innovators, I mean quite simply someone who is a creative problem solver. Solve problems without creativity, you're not innovating. Conversely, you can be all kinds of creative, not able to solve problems, no innovation. So that's what they want. But then I began to see something else that continues to disturb me deeply. Do you know that more than 70% of our economy is based on consumer spending? Did you know that? I didn't know that. We used to be the #1 manufacturer in the world. That used to be half the economy. Now we're the #1 consumer in the world. And worse, that consumption has been fueled for 25 years by debt. Our debt, credit card debt, house debt. Savings rate in 2007 was -3%. As much as anything, this current unemployment crisis we have is mainly about the fact that consumers aren't spending as much money anymore. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest millennials have different values. Many of them will choose not to buy a house, which is a lucky thing because they wouldn't be able to afford it anyway. Maybe not even choose to buy a car. They like zip cars. They like bikes. What's that going to do to our consumer-driven economy? So what I've come to understand is that, and what many economists are beginning to suggest, we need a different kind of economy. We need an economy where we manufacture, but not things. We manufacture, we produce ideas. We have to become a country of creative problem solvers. We have to become a country that graduates more kids able to solve more problems around the world, beginning with sustainability. How do we do that? You know, we've always been known as a very innovative country. People say, well, it's because of our good infrastructure, until recently. People say, well, it's because of our liberal immigration policies, until recently. Because of availability of venture capital, because of the rule of law. What about education? Part of the problem or part of the solution? Now I'm going to ask and answer a question so fast you won't be able to Google it. Trivial Pursuit question of the day. What do Bill Gates, Buckminster Fuller invented geodesic domes, Edwin Land, who created the Polaroid instant camera, Bonnie Raitt, the folk singer, and Martin Zuckerberg all have in common, besides being innovators? They were not college dropouts. They were Harvard college dropouts. That's different. Steve Jobs, ordinary college dropout. Michael Dell, ordinary college dropout. I love doing that to Harvard, especially here. It's really fun. Never get tired of that. So with this new book, I became very interested in the question of what must we do differently to develop the capabilities of many, many more of our young people to be creative problem solvers. So with this book, I began by interviewing a wide variety of young people in their 20s who, in fact, were creative problem solvers, some in STEM fields, some in the arts, some who were social entrepreneurs. I then studied their ecosystem. That is to say, I interviewed all of their parents to see if I could discern patterns of parenting. I then asked each one of them, was there a teacher or a mentor who'd made a significant difference? Come to find out, most could name one or two, rarely more than that. The range of the teachers in grades was elementary all the way to graduate school. I interviewed all of those teachers. And I made what was for me a very troubling discovery. In every case, the teachers who made the greatest difference in the lives of these young innovators were outliers in their institutional setting, teaching in ways that were fundamentally different than their peers. My research took me to Harvard, Stanford, M.A.T, Carnegie Mellon, interviewing teachers who'd made a difference in the lives of these kids, and I come to discover none of them had tenure, nor were they going to get tenure. They were outliers. But their teaching was remarkably similar from elementary through graduate school. Then I spent time studying those few schools that really do teach innovation. And it didn't take me long because there aren't very many. I went to the MIT Media Lab. I went to the brand new Olin College of Engineering, Stanford D School, High Tech High, New Tech High, and a number of elementary programs, Reggio Emilia, Bing Nursery School, Stanford. And again, I saw a pattern. The kinds of teaching and learning I saw there was totally consistent with how my outlier teachers teach, and very different from what we see in most schools. And I've come to understand that the culture of schooling, as we have practiced it and continue to perpetuate it in most places, is very fundamentally and radically at odds with a culture of learning that develops creative problem-solving skills. 5 contradictions. Number 1, culture of schooling is all about measuring and rewarding individual achievement. Well, that's fine, except that innovation is a team sport. Knowing this, these teachers built accountable teamwork into every single assignment and evaluated collaboration skills as much as individual achievement, and wherever possible, they team-taught their courses. Contradiction number 2, culture of schooling is all about compartmentalizing knowledge. Science lives way far away from math, which is farther away from the humanities, and we favor specialization. Well, there's a place for that, except that innovation happens at the boundaries of academic disciplines, not within them. Judy Gilbert, then director of talent at Google, said to me, if there's one thing educators must realize is that problems can neither be understood nor solved within the bright lines of individual academic disciplines. Contradiction number 3 is kind of the experience of schooling. It's fundamentally a passive consuming experience in too many classrooms, where you sit and you get. It's an infantilizing experience because there's only one expert in the room, and that's the one doing all the talking. Very different in the culture of learning to be an innovator, where the emphasis is on creating, not consuming. The emphasis is on empowering students through effective coaching. Contradictions 4 and 5, I think, are the most challenging of all. Contradiction 4 is all about the F word. No, not that one. Failure. It's the worst thing that can happen to you in school. It's how we penalize students. Problem is, innovation demands that you take risks, make mistakes, and fail. I went to IDEO, the most innovative company in the world, many say. Come to find out their motto as a company is fail early and fail often. It seemed a little crazy to me until they explained that there is no innovation without trial and error. I went to the D school at Stanford talking about the whole problem of grading. Said, yeah, we're kind of thinking F is the new A. I don't recommend taking that to your districts just yet. I mean, it needs a little curation. I went to, finally at Olin, I talked to a student. She said, you know, we don't even talk about grades, GPA here. What we do talk a lot about, though, is iteration. My new favorite word, going from 1.0 to 2.0. How do we teach kids? How many, let me ask a question. How many of you have learned more from your mistakes than your successes? Raise your hands. Everybody. Why don't we allow that in school? Why would we penalize mistakes? Rub kids' faces in it? How can we create a culture where not only is it okay to make mistakes, but where you understand that is the only way to learn? Where there's no such thing as failure so long as you've reflected on your mistakes and you apply what you've learned to your next effort or iteration. Last challenge, last contradiction, motivation. So to talk about skill and will. Here comes the will, the motivation part. Because as you know, we rely far too much on extrinsic incentives to motivate learning in our schools. Carrots and sticks, fear of failure, reward with good grades and money and stuff like that. Problem is, many in this generation, and these innovators whom I profiled, are far, far more intrinsically motivated, doing their best work not because of a carrot or a stick, but rather because they want to make a difference, more than they want to make a lot of money. Then I went back and tried to understand what had their parents and teachers done to stimulate and reinforce this intrinsic motivation. And again, I found a pattern. Both parents and teachers had explicitly reinforced 3 things: play, passion, and purpose. Parents encouraging much more exploratory play, less structured time, fewer toys. Toys like sand, clay, paint, blocks, and when they were older, Legos, toys you create things with. Limiting screen time. Everybody hear that? Limiting screen time. Silicon Valley executives send their kids to Waldorf schools which ban computers until, I think, the age of 12. That's a little extreme. Teachers the same. They built a spirit of play into their curriculum. Ed Carrier teaches engineers at Stanford, talked about bringing an element of whimsy into every assignment he gives his kids. Understanding the spirit of adult play is essential for creativity and problem solving. As these kids grew older, these parents were very adept at carefully observing their children at play because they wanted to understand what most interested their children, what motivated them. And they would create a careful selection of a buffet of new things for kids to try because they believed that for a kid to find and pursue a real passion was much more important than mere academic achievement for its own sake, because it's in the pursuit of a passion where you best learn the thing now we call grit, perseverance, focus, self-discipline, self-regulation. As these kids grew older, teachers did the same. They built time into the curriculum, and I'm going to come back to this, where kids could ask their own questions, pursue their own interests, understanding that the passion to learn, the curiosity, had to be nurtured with opportunities on a regular basis. Lastly, as these kids grew older, their passions morphed and evolved. They didn't stay the same, as you would expect. But in every case, they matured into a deeper sense of purpose, a desire to in some way give back or make a difference. And that's because both parents and teachers had reinforced one simple lesson. The lesson being that we are not here on this earth merely for ourselves. We have some responsibility to give back and make a difference, even if it's in small ways. You know this, you're educators. That's a calling more than it is even a career. They also reinforce the simple idea that we have to work to understand and empathize with people who are different and less fortunate than ourselves. So there's a lot that might be said about the implications for this, and in a couple of minutes I'm going to invite you to debrief in pairs at your tables for a few minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. But let me suggest a few things that I believe we must consider as implications. Number one, we have to advocate for the outcomes that matter most and an accountability system aligned with those outcomes. We need to partner with business leaders and community leaders to advocate for the skills that matter most in the 21st century. And it is not memorization. I would suggest we start with the 4 C's. Critical thinking, and we need to define it and determine what does critical thinking look like at the 12th grade, 8th grade, and 5th grade level. What would be the performance standard in your school or your district or your classroom for critical thinking? Communication skills, oral and written, collaboration, and creative problem solving. And what is the performance standard for your communication skills? I don't mean did you pass MCAS. I mean, can your students write with voice? Can they give an effective oral presentation? Can they report on the results of their research? And what is the performance standard, again, for 8th, 5th, 12th, but backwards mapped from 12th? What I'm talking about is the merit badge approach to learning, where we define the outcomes that matter most and we assess them to a performance standard. There are only 3 grades I can justify: A, B, or incomplete. Your work is incomplete until you've met my performance standard, which is a B. If you're truly excellent, then it means an A. No more bell curve. How many of you want to fly with a C- airline pilot? Raise your hands. How about a D+ dentist? I don't think so. We must expect competence of every kid. We vary the amount of time or the amount of support they may need. No more graduation on the basis of seat time served. Graduation has to be on the basis of competencies mastered. 12, 8, and 5 for starters. And we have to advocate for this new system. It isn't going to come about by our just continuing to say yes. So I'm talking about our not waiting and our developing an assessment system aligned with these new outcomes. You don't have to wait for permission, and you don't even probably have to seek forgiveness. Every student should have a digital portfolio beginning in 1st grade, where students begin with teachers to collect and curate their best work that shows evidence of these 4 skills plus grit. We can do that tomorrow. Pathbright.com, great avenue, great portal. Celio is another. For individuals, they're free. You don't need permission. You don't need money. We can do this starting tomorrow. And we can start graduating kids on the basis of exhibitions of mastery, as well as evidence in their work. Let's understand something really clearly here. How many employers use standardized tests or GPAs as for important hiring or promotion decisions? None. They use collective human judgment informed by evidence. If it's good enough for corporations, it's got to be good enough for us. Even Google, who was famous or notorious, depending on your point of view, for only hiring kids from name brand colleges with the highest GPAs and the highest test scores, has completely abandoned all of that. Laszlo Bock, their new director of people operations, looked at the data and said, quote, "It is worthless," unquote. His words. Worthless. They don't even necessarily require a BA anymore. 15% of their teams have no degree whatsoever. So what do they look for now? Evidence of a sense of mission and personal autonomy. And instead of asking those ridiculous brain tweezer questions like estimate how many ping pong balls you can get into a 747, you know what they ask now? Describe a complex analytic problem you've tried to solve. How do we prepare kids for that world? Mission, autonomy, solving a complex problem? That's the assessment the real world is going to give our kids in order to be employed. That's what we have to prepare them for. So a couple of other suggestions that I'd like to throw out. I believe every school and school district needs a research and development budget. You know, Microsoft's is 13%, Google's 17, 20%. What's your R&D budget for educational R&D? And I don't mean just online learning. We need state and district funds to encourage teachers. I want to see a fund that teams of teachers can apply to, not individuals. I would suggest using more of our professional development money in this way rather than in more conferences. Teams of teachers applying for grants to get time to work on digital portfolios, the students and their own. We should be assessing all teachers on the basis of the same performance standards as evidenced in their digital portfolios reviewed by external peers. That is the idea that you can assess a teacher's effectiveness on the basis of a 2-hour test given to students for which they have almost no accountability. That's crazy. That is going to drive the best out of the profession. It already is, and it demeans the profession. We have to advocate for accountability 2.0 in that domain as well. Every teacher should graduate with a digital portfolio from ed schools that shows evidence of mastery and should periodically have that digital portfolio reviewed. So the R&D goes for interdisciplinary courses. The R&D goes for student and teacher digital portfolios. In time, I want to see lab schools. I want to see schools that are existence proofs, as well as R&D centers for developing new curriculum, new assessments, and teacher training. Teacher training should not happen at Harvard or anywhere else. It should happen in the best schools. Embedded teacher preparation. And the student motivation part, let me make one final modest proposal. How many of you know about the Google rule? Raise your hands. 20% rule? Well, Google may have modified it, but a lot of other companies still use it. 3M has had the same rule for 40 years, 15% rule. The idea is you give every employee a percentage of time to work on any project of their choice. It has been the greatest engine of innovation that anything companies have done. What if we did this? What if we said to every student, you have 20% of your time to be the architect of your own learning? A period a day a week, a month between semesters, lots of different ways to cut it, lots of different ways people are already doing it. Whole idea is that it's not playtime, it's not free time. Students are accountable because of their digital portfolios. We're going to review the work they've done. We're going to coach them to set new standards, new learning goals for themselves. But the whole idea is that they are the architects of their learning. We know that mastery comes from that experience. First of all, I'm going to apologize in advance. My wife and I have to be on a noon flight to Atlanta, so I'm not going to be able to linger. But they tell me there are a few books in the back that if I have time, I'll personalize for you at the very end here. But I want to learn from you now. I want to hear your Q&A. There are 3 mics, I believe, people standing up with them. Raise your hand and the mic will come to you. I will try to point to you to help right here in front.
So in the past, we've been focusing, well, schools have been focusing on trying to reach certain levels of content proficiencies and all, and what you were just saying talked about instead looking at their skills and competencies. But where is there the room for maybe individual strengths that might be not balanced with everything, and how do we allow for that so that kids can really excel at different things and different competencies?
That's great. Thank you. First of all, I want to be clear. This is not skills versus content. You do not teach skills without engaging students in rich and challenging content. That is the only way to teach critical thinking. And the only way to teach reasoning is to engage students in rich and challenging content and get them to question and to cite evidence. So I want to be really, really clear. I'm not throwing content out. There is such a thing as cultural literacy. I believe E.D. Hirsch is right about some of that. But what we need to understand is that can no longer be the only or even the primary goal of school. It has to be about skill and will. Of the 3 things, you need all 3: content, knowledge, skill, and will. Of the 3, motivation is probably the one that is most important and the one we do the most damage to. And that's why your question about individual interests and talents is incredibly important. That's, for me, what the 20% rule addresses, where kids have a chance to develop their own interests and their own skills 20% time, not for a grade. It's a credit, no credit, right? You did some work, you get credit. We're not going to evaluate, your film as a B- film. We're going to critique it, sure. But did you spend that time well? That's your time to learn, to develop your capabilities. Okay, where are the mics? Where are the hands? We got a hand here. Do we have a mic here? Mic's coming to you. I may need a little help in the back. You may have to shout and scream to get a mic at you, or to have me see you, because I'm blinded by the light.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, it works. So One of the things I was thinking about is there are a lot of different stakeholders when it comes to education, because it is a system that is connected to our economy. So one of the stakeholders I deal with most is parents, and their biggest concern is getting their kid into a really good college, right?
Yep.
So when you're doing that, especially at the undergraduate level specifically, like, can you think of any ways that colleges, universities, top-tier universities like Harvard, MIT, Stanford, are not holding kids accountable to grades, to standardized tests?
Yep, great question. All right, so here's my speech about the whole college thing. First of all, the chances of white middle-class kids getting into name-brand colleges continues to plummet every year because of the competition. You really want to get a kid into a name-brand school, you should move to North Dakota, and you should discover the cure for cancer and play 4 varsity sports as well as the trombone. Then maybe you'll, and you have a Native American grandmother. Then maybe you'll have a chance. Maybe. Second thing about name-brand schools is that it's not worth the cost. And I'm not talking about finances, that too, but the emotional cost. 40% of Harvard undergraduates are on medication. Third important fact, going to a name-brand school is no longer the advantage it once was. It is no longer a good old boy network, as I just described with Google. It is all about proficiency, all about competencies. You go look at the list of leaders in business and elsewhere and look at the decreasing percentage who went to name-brand schools. It's a tiny minority. The world cares about what you can do with what you know, not where you got a degree. So that's a very different world. And some colleges are responding to that, and they're going to have to, because I'll tell you, Clay Christensen says half of all colleges will be bankrupt in 10 years because of MOOCs. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're all going to become assisted living homes. Great facility, really. So we need to help parents understand these new realities. They're terrified. They want their kids to have a competitive advantage, but the competitive advantage that they can best help their kids develop is the passion that I've been describing, and the skill and the discipline to pursue that passion, no matter what it is. I tell stories in the book about kids who, are crazy into funny, odd things as kids, and later become extraordinary entrepreneurs. I don't have time to recite them, but the stories are so clear. And that's why I spent a lot of time on parenting in this new book, because I think parents need to understand there's a different and better way to give our kids a competitive advantage in the 21st century. And we need to help them see that. We also need to lead them to the more than 850 colleges and universities that require no forms of standardized testing for admission. Good schools, Bates, Bowdoin, Colby, Carleton, lots. Tufts University now invites kids to submit YouTube videos as a part of their application. MIT is inviting kids to submit evidence of projects they've done. So that world is beginning to change. Yes, please.
You've discussed parents' roles and higher education. I'm interested in what you think K-12 can do. Educators in service, support staff in schools. I was a teacher in the early 60s in a very special place in Newton, Massachusetts, called Meadowbrook Junior High School, where all of the principles that you outlined in your talk were in operation. It was 1 in a million, and what I've observed is that we learned a lot, but we don't use it. We make change and try something out, and then there's no willingness to continue. So, issue, K-12 schools, and how do we do what we know to do but don't?
Somebody cut that. Oh, it's back. First and foremost, I deeply believe that through our professional associations, we have to become advocates. I want to see every educator wear a button and have a bumper sticker that says, "Hold me accountable for what matters most." Let me be really clear. MCAS may be the best standardized test in the country, and Common Core may be somewhat better, but they are 20th century solutions to 21st century problems. They're still far, far too much about content acquisition and not enough about using and applying that content. We have to advocate for accountability 2.0. We're going forward, not backward. We're not giving up accountability. We're not going back to the days where we ignored the achievement of disadvantaged kids. We're not doing any of that. This is not an anti-testing movement. This is a movement for better and higher and more professional forms of accountability for kids and for educators. Only then can we start actually applying what we have learned and what we will continue to learn through R&D to build a better accountability system. Only then, once we have really meaningful accountability, can we ask for the freedom we need as educators to deliver the results that are so important. We have to say, okay, hold us accountable for what matters most, but then give us the autonomy and the freedom to do it in the ways that we know work. Where are we on hands and questions here? We've got time for a couple more. Got hand here, hand here. Okay, yes, please.
All right, just a quick question because we couldn't hear you. You recommended 2 portfolio sites. I actually teach 2-term classes where the final everything is an e-portfolio, so I'm curious what they were again.
All right, I'm not promoting any of these, but the 2 that I've seen that look promising to me, one is Pathbrite, PATHBRITE.com. The other is Seelio, SEELIO.com. There's several others. Google it. Tom Vander Ark has recommended a number of others. You may want to kind of look at his reviews of them, but I think Pathbrite comes out on top. I've met their founding CEO. She's really impressive. Yeah? Right here. By the way, this is now the 5th or 6th question being asked by a woman, which is wonderful, but I'm wondering where are all the men in the audience? But hey, who's counting? Go ahead.
Hi. I find your talk today very compelling, and probably everyone in the room is sort of already sold on this. But in my school district, we're trying to go one-to-one, and we have a small group of parents who are really fearful about it and think that we're giving up on things like handwriting and division on paper. I'm hoping. But what would you say to those parents to help convince them?
I am, first of all, persuaded by the idea that one size does not fit all, that in many districts there are profound divisions, and that we need to accommodate for that. And so I have long believed that districts need to move towards a portfolio of offerings in schools and within schools within school programs. So if you've got a very conservative group of parents who are adamantly opposed to what you're doing, give them what they want. Hold them accountable to the same standards. But if parents hate this, you invest far too much time and effort and create far too much animosity to ram it down their throats. We can't do that. We've got to give them choices. That's my opinion. Where are we with mics and questions here? Yes, sir. A gentleman, yes.
I find a lot of your ideas very compelling and intriguing. I'm thinking about the idea of a rubric, which seems to be a static construction, and you're talking about getting kids to graduate based on competencies. And so I imagine people would come up with a wide range of portfolios, and I'm trying to reconcile that with a concept of a rubric which would, I guess, determine success criteria.
That's a great question. I neglected to mention that as a part of Accountability 2.0, we should periodically audit random portfolios of students. And we should invite employers and college teachers to come in and do those audits. Say, does this meet our performance standard for college ready and career ready? So that there has to be quality control. You're absolutely right. It can't be a free-for-all. Unfortunately, that's too much of what we had in the 60s. So there has to be some genuine performance-based accountability, and I think that's one good way to do it. Deborah Meyer did that in the late 80s with her Central Park East High School. She had horrible test scores from kids in Harlem, but she invited employers and college teachers and college admissions officers in to audit student portfolios and exhibitions of mastery, and they got all of them accepted into college on the basis of that evidence. Great question. Yes, sir. Yes. Not yet.
Oh, all right, there we go. So I'm in a one-to-one district, and we actually have some teachers that are doing some of the innovative things that you've been talking about. Student-centered, self-guided education, and one of them's over there, and she's awesome.
Great.
But the problem is that we're running into is for like administration and things like parents, they're still stuck in this old school ideal that teaching is standing in front of a classroom and dictating. And that's it. And kids sit and they take notes and they take tests and whatever. So when they see something new and interesting and self-guided where the teacher isn't standing there and talking, right, they get upset. And that's even on the administrative level outside of parents. So it's kind of like, what do you do to fight this old school ideal?
Similar to the question that was just asked, I think we have to give people a choice. I think, first of all, we have to do the R&D a step at a time voluntarily. So I would suggest, instead of trying to go massively one-to-one, you have an opt-in program where classrooms or schools where the overwhelming majority of parents and teachers want it, they get it. Then you show evidence of success. You invite the skeptics in to see it. But my suggestion is don't try to do it all at once unless you've got overwhelming support. If you've got real pushback, do it a step at a time on a voluntary basis. Voluntary for teachers, voluntary for parents. This whole idea that you can create change through compliance is a 20th century obsolete idea. You can't have buy-in, you need ownership. It's a different change leadership model. You need to create ownership. People need to understand the problem they're trying to solve. Too often we see one-to-one as a solution without a problem being named, an answer to no question. What is it for? What's the goal? Why is it going to be different? Why is that important to kids' lives and their futures? Too often we don't address those questions. All right, time for one more question. Right here.
Thank you. I'm a visual arts teacher, K through graduate school. Well, I'll start by saying, I always say there is no MCAS for passion.
Right.
How do you convince your district and statewide to expand the arts rather than cut them?
Yeah. First and foremost, we need to understand the arts as both opportunities for exceptionally talented kids, but also as a way of seeing the world and as a way of having a particular kind of problem-solving skill. I want to see the arts embedded into the humanities. I would teach an American Studies course, not a history course, not a literature course. I would ask the question, who are we as Americans? What are the forces that have shaped us as a people and as a country? What are the challenges that face us in the future? And I would look at literature. I would look at history, of course. I would look at the arts, photography. I would look at music. So we need to see those as lenses, as well as tools for problem solving. You know, one of the reasons that Olin is so profoundly different as an engineering school, the first required course is user-oriented design. And it's all about the arts. It's why people talk about STEAM instead of STEM. Folks, you're technophiles, so you might appreciate this little dilemma I had. You know, I made this documentary film with Bob Compton called The Finland Phenomenon, all about Finland's extraordinary education system. I was then invited to Singapore. Bob came along thinking make a film about Singapore. Turns out there's no story to be told there. It's a cram culture. That's why those test scores are so good. Kids, it's all on kids' backs, 12, 14 hours a day, every kid having a private tutor, not a film we wanted to make. But Bob challenged me. We're sitting in a cafe, he said, Tony, you can't just write a book about innovation. It has to be innovative. And I roll my eyes. He says, here, look, if you persuade your publisher to put QR codes in the book, I will make a series of short videos, and he did, more than 60 short videos that are called up with your smartphone that has a QR code reader in it. So we brought a little piece of that along because it gives you a different sense, perhaps, apropos of the arts and visual learning, a different sense of these young innovators, a different sense of these teachers, and of the people who have really advocated for a fundamentally different education. You know, being a recovering high school English teacher, I am required at some point in every presentation to quote literature. I mean, it's kind of in the contract. So, how many of you remember the opening to Tale of Two Cities, Dickens famous? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I don't need to tell you all of the ways in which these are incredibly challenging times for us as educators. You know it, you live it, far better than I. But what may be less clear to many of you is that I think it is also the best of times. I have the rare privilege to go around and speak to extraordinary educators like yourselves, who are committed to making a difference, who are committed to not merely reforming, but reinventing education for the 21st century. So I simply want to end by thanking you. Thank you for the incredibly important work you're doing. Thank you for what you're doing for kids every single day. Thank you.